Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Russell, and my pronouns are he, his.
In this episode, we'll discuss the first Sunday of Lent, which this year falls on March 6th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive today, we are excited to have Russell Braman back to talk about the Jewish festival called Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. Russell serves as a chaplain for Iowa Methodist Medical Center and Blank Children's Hospital in Des Moines, Iowa, and also enjoys teaching prayer book Hebrew to folks of all ages. Nerdily, he loves Harry Potter, The West Wing, and has been known to geek out on languages.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yay.
Good to be back.
It is good to have you back. So today, in our first reading, we read about the Jewish festival of Shavuot. Can you tell us what this festival celebrates?
So it's a harvest festival that celebrates, I want to say, the barley harvest. And it also, in more modern settings, is kind of the festival that we use to celebrate receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, in large part because it comes 49 days after Passover.
Sure.
So if you've ever heard of the counting of the Omer, that's what we're doing. You're counting from the second Passover Seder, 49 days to Shavuot, which is when we receive the Torah. So you go from kind of redemption to revelation.
Interesting.
Over the course of about 2 months.
Cool. That is particularly interesting to me because in Christianity, we celebrate Easter right around the same time that Jewish people tend to celebrate Passover. It's calculated a little bit differently, so it's a little bit off sometimes. And our Easter season is also like 7 weeks, 49 days, and then Pentecost. I had never made that connection between those two time periods.
Is Pentecost Shavuot?
Pentecost is 50 days after Easter, and I know that that's also, for us at least, I know that's also a name given to a Jewish holiday, but I think that's
Shavuot. It will make sense.
That might be. Yeah.
I'm going to just...
Because it's also 50 days.
I am less well versed on the Christian liturgical calendar, but
Pentecost just means 50 days in Greek. That's literally, yeah. So...
Let me look.
No, I'm curious.
I think so, but
I know what you guys call the Festival of Booths. We call
Shavuot,
Sukkot,
also called Pentecost, in full Hag Shavuot, Festival of Weeks. So yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Right.
So while I was looking things up for this episode, I have to say that this was one of my favorite discoveries. Is it true that this festival would be very different if there had been alarm clocks in ancient Israel?
Most of Jewish culture would be very different if there were alarm clocks in ancient Israel.
Okay, that's also probably fair.
But what I imagine you're referring to is we settle our calendar by literally observing the lunar cycle.
Yes.
In Jerusalem at the appropriate time. So, if you ever hear, in many Jewish communities, Rosh Hashanah is observed for 2 days.
Right.
The holy days in Sukkot and Passover, the first and the last, are observed for 2 days. There's always an extra day included to pad any goof ups that might have gotten made in observing the lunar cycle or in communicating it, because what they would do is they would calculate the full moon and then they'd light fires on various Judean hilltops so that,
like in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Yes.
Gondor calls for aid.
They're calling for a different thing, but yes, they would light fires in the Judean hills to signal to the other communities that, yep, it's the new moon, so it's the new month, and then you count the festivals accordingly. Rosh Hashanah just happens to be the only one that's actually on the first day of the month.
Well, and also when I was reading up for this, I found out that there is now a tradition of staying up the night before Shavuot to study Torah, and the reason for that was because supposedly the Israelites overslept the first time.
I don't know they didn't want to. But yeah, there is. It's called Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the repair of the night of Shavuot, and it's in some communities you will stay up all night. Usually there is obscene quantities of coffee and cheesecake.
Ooh.
Wikipedia definitely claims that this holiday is not fully responsible, but definitely helped the spread of coffee as a phenomenon across the continent of Eurasia in a big way.
I would believe that.
I was going to ask you what, particularly because it's tied into the harvest, what foods are connected to the festival. But if it's the barley harvest, are there like barley foods too, or just like coffee and cheesecake?
It's dairy is
Mm-hmm.
Shavuot is known for dairy, and I'm not. It's one of those things I'm not 100% sure why. I think there's an argument that Torah is the milk of the Jewish people, although I may have just made that up completely. But dairy is sort of the custom on Shavuot, just like on Hanukkah you eat things that are fried in oil to commemorate the miracle of the oil.
Sure.
That makes sense. Yeah, interesting. So do you have like a favorite type of cheesecake?
A friend of mine who shall remain nameless at one point took a piece of cheesecake away from me, not thinking out of belief that I wasn't enjoying it sufficiently. Cheesecake's not my favorite thing in the world. I have grown to appreciate it more and more, but I have had it taken away from me for fear that I wouldn't appropriately.
I mean, that story could have gone two ways, right? It could have gone the way that it went of like, because I don't appreciate it, someone took it away, which like, honestly, I might do the same thing because I love cheesecake. But it also could have gone, someone took it away because I didn't look like I was appreciating enough, and they learned their lesson and never did that again.
I was going to say, in my family, we wouldn't tell that story because that would involve ruining our plausible deniability. So, yeah.
I think I was too shocked at the moment to effectively defend my cheesecake.
That makes sense.
That's what forks are for. Yeah. So how is this festival often celebrated today? I imagine there have to be differences depending on where you live, obviously, but...
Less than you might think. So the tikkun is a big part of the observance of Shavuot. And again, it depends on your community. I've been to places where you literally stay up all night, and I was slotted to teach at 2:00 in the morning.
Oof.
Speaking of nerdery and Judaism, I think at that point I had worked a teaching session on Jewish values in the Hunger Games.
Ooh.
Wow.
Or Jewish philosophy in the Hunger Games. And so I think I was teaching that at like 2:00 in the morning. I think this was
I could see getting scheduled for the 2:00 slot as either you are new and therefore
that's what it was.
The lowest ranked, or yes, because I figured it was either that or they truly trusted you to actually stay awake at that hour. In which case, that would have been a deep compliment. But
I think I did it. I think I did the 2:00 session. Then I think I started walking back home to sleep. I don't think I made it too much past that.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
in those communities, oftentimes then they will do a sunrise shacharit service and do the morning Shavuot festival service. They don't take their time with it and go and kind of speed through it and do that at sunrise. But otherwise, like most Jewish holidays, there's a full festival morning service with Torah reading and all the various festival editions.
Okay, but if you're staying up all night, then probably
people tend to want to do that quickly so they can go home and go to sleep.
So do they still read the Torah?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
sure.
I just wanted to check because you said it was really fast, and then you said that the other one has like a full festival with Torah reading. So
no, it's not a halachic Shavuot service if you don't do the Torah reading, which is
okay.
What does halachic mean for our listeners?
Certainly, looks like it's Exodus 19.
Interesting, Exodus 19.
Which is
well, that would make sense.
Which is getting Torah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And then the
that's what we had you on here for last year.
And I'll explain my terms in a moment. Maftir is the same one for all of the major holidays, and that's the first fruits.
Sure.
Actually, that might be specifically Shavuot.
Yeah. So Maftir, which like from what we read in Deuteronomy, which is the reading for today, Shavuot seems like it should be the Maftir reading.
I believe it is. Maftir is usually an extra reading at the end. I believe because of the additional sacrifice on Shabbat and on holidays.
Oh, okay.
To swing back to halachically, because you asked.
Mm-hmm.
So halacha is the system of Jewish law. And you could take entire graduate school courses and only cover bits and pieces of it. So it kind of takes what is written in the Torah and then kind of, which is then elaborated into the Talmud with all of the various debates, and then eventually, shuffled into various halachic codes. So the different Jewish movements and different rabbis will, abide by different codes. There's a book I have hanging around here somewhere, The Guide to Jewish Law and Practice by Rabbi Isaac Klein, and that's kind of the one that I use when I have specific questions. But that's the idea of halakha, that there are certain, Jewish legal rules and restrictions about keeping kosher, about observing holidays, all those kinds of things.
Sure. Well, and half of the fun of being able to connect to new people on social media, and especially Twitter, is getting to see them discuss possible what ifs. And I have to say, I've run into a few different conversations on social media about Jewish people discussing, so how would aliens work into this? Or how would dinosaurs work into that? Or, that kind of thing. And those are always great fun.
You also haven't truly nerdily lived unless you have read Masechet Chopsticks, which is a parody somebody wrote of a Talmudic tractate about the rules for eating Chinese food on Christmas.
That sounds fantastic.
It is delightful.
Yeah. And I haven't reread it, and I'm starting to wonder how well it has aged. But Christopher Moore wrote Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff, Christ's Childhood Pal. And that has a part of the story includes Joshua, who is Jesus, Joshua's birthday. And they are somewhere in Asia, I think in what is now known as China, but I'm not positive. And they're eating Chinese food for his birthday. And so there's this hat tip to the tradition continuing for millennia.
Well, because, in reality, Chinese food restaurants tended to be the ones that were open on Christmas because their owners were not generally observing Christmas with their families.
Yep.
And so, you can go into all the sociological whatnot of what eating kosher at a Chinese restaurant looks like. Although now there are kosher Chinese restaurants.
I was going to say, there also isn't a lot of dairy in Chinese food.
No, but there is a lot of pork and shrimp.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Okay. Circling back.
Sorry.
Because I'm curious, what is your favorite aspect of Jewish philosophy in the Hunger Games?
So I kind of used it more as a what not to do.
Fair.
Generally, when it comes to the Hunger Games, a dystopia, that's a good idea.
Thou shalt not, put children in an arena to fight to the death. I think that's not a bad rule to start with. Absolutely.
One of the philosophers that has kind of stuck with me is Martin Buber and his I and Thou philosophy. The basic gist of it is, with apologies to Rabbi Buber, the way that we come to know God is through the way that we relate to other people. Mm-hmm. And so the people for whom our relationship is entirely based on knowing and drawing close to that person, those are the relationships that kind of mirror and mimic our relationship with God. So the relationship you have with your cab driver who you are paying to take you someplace, or the person who delivers your newspaper is one thing, but the relationship you have with a close friend or family member is much more, I am relating to you for the sake of relating to you. I am relating to you to know you because I love you and care about you. That is how we relate to God and how we hope God relates to us.
So taking out the transactional, it's much more transactional when it's a cab driver or something.
Right. So Buber has the I-it relationship and the I-thou relationship.
Yes. I think Martin Luther King Jr. expanded on that concept in the letter to the Birmingham jail, which is where I ran into it last. But
letter from a Birmingham jail?
That's probably yes. Sorry, writing to the jail wouldn't have made a lot of sense.
Yeah, writing to the white moderate pastors.
Yeah, but yes, I think that's where I first ran into that concept. But it is a beautiful way of thinking about our relationships with other people and asking ourselves, is this really how we're supposed to be treating them?
Yeah, that makes sense. Then that is all over the place in Hunger Games, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The way they deal with food and the way that they deal with drink and, eating to the point of you need to make yourself throw up to be able to eat more. Mm-hmm. The relationship with food is very different. There's lots of ways to teach it. And I would probably, if I was going to rework it, do it differently the second time through. but
Huh.
I've taught that a couple of times.
Yeah,
I might have also tossed in some Holocaust theology because that seemed appropriate too.
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, that's well, and especially like the connections between indigenous people, native people, and reservations, and Holocaust and ghettos and concentration camps, and the ways that and native people and reservations and districts in the Hunger Games. Like there's a whole triangle of connection
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
There's also a very good movie I saw recently, the name I don't remember, on Netflix about this, Anglo-Canadian guy who gets hired to teach out in Nunavut. I don't think it's on a reservation, but certainly among a community that was impacted by residential schools,
Mm.
and comes to teach the kids lacrosse as a means of, helping them to connect with him, the school, the academics, and kind of how that, moves across with him gaining familiarity with, who they are and what they are. And it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of there's certainly a white savior aspect to it, but it's kind of an interesting
Yeah.
movie as well.
Also interesting because doesn't lacrosse have its origins in
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
indigenous cultures?
They didn't talk about
Yeah.
they didn't talk about that part of it in this movie.
Why
I'm
would you?
not surprised.
There are other movies
But
where they do.
Right.
yeah, yeah, but that's an interesting there's a connection I think in this conversation that we're having, right? We're talking to you specifically about a festival, about a holy day in Judaism, and there like in the United States, there is a long period of time where native people were not allowed and were legally persecuted and harmed and killed for expressing their traditions and their faith practices and their holy days
Or their languages.
and their languages. And I think so that's also been the case depending on what time period we're talking about, both biblically and historic and non-biblical historically for Jewish people, of when when have Jewish practices been banned, when have people been what does it look like to be in exile? And we get that in the story of Daniel. How do you navigate being in exile and keeping faith practices or not keeping faith practices, all of that stuff.
Heck, look at the entirety of the Babylonian Talmud.
Yeah.
That's why it was written.
Yeah.
Or that's how that came to be.
Sure. Well, and I was also surprised to see that Shavuot has a connection to the Book of Ruth as well. And the source I was looking at said it was partly because of the Barley Festival, but also because it involved someone taking on the Torah, taking on voluntarily adopting it, as Ruth, as a foreigner, converts to Judaism and voluntarily adopts it of her own free will.
Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that it is. It's one of, we call them the Megillas, the Megillot.
Mhm.
There are 5 of them. Let's see if I can get them: Ruth, Song of Songs, Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes. Oh, and Jonah, I believe.
See, that's interesting to me because Ecclesiastes has such a different tone than the others. The others all have some happiness and joy to them, and wow.
Ecclesiastes is the one you read on Sukkot.
Okay.
With the idea being that the world is impermanent.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's why you build a hut that you cover the top with branches and leaves. It's meant to be movable. The world is impermanent.
Yeah.
Sure.
Anything can happen. So we give you Ecclesiastes.
That's yeah.
Yeah.
This is a little bit random, except that technically this is the deep dive topic. But how have you noticed the traditions and the practices around Shavuot? Have they shifted? Have you been able to celebrate? Have people been celebrating online? How has the pandemic impacted Shavuot?
I think with the ability to be online, we've been able to do more of the Tikkun Leil Shavuot stuff. Smaller communities are often less able to do the full all-night thing, in part because of lack of interest and in part because of lack of teachers. The times I've been at ones that have gone all night, it's been in big communities where you have 5, 6, 7 teachers taking an hour and teaching a lesson. So I think that's it. I mean, I think also, my synagogue is meeting in person. We're all masked. other communities are making different choices, but
Mm-hmm.
I think that, gathering together has also changed.
Yeah.
We don't like
Yeah.
it used to be that when you were called to the Torah, you went up and you were standing next to the Torah reader behind the lectern. Oh, we no longer do that. We're keeping people much more separate when we're
Yeah.
in person. So, there's attempts to make it safer.
Yeah. Well, and I remember in seminary, frequently for a seminarian, so somewhat sporadically, attended Shabbat services at the synagogue that was like 6 blocks away. It was like next door neighbors with President Obama at the time, so it was like you had to go behind Secret Service to get to the synagogue. But
Cool.
I remember for Shabbat services, the Torah would actually be brought around among people, and so I imagine that also would be a very different.
We don't do that. We don't do that anymore now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is hard. It's
Yeah.
hard to like. I hear in your voice a sadness about that, I think.
It's a cool part. It's so there's this symbolism that the Torah is for everybody, and it's the
Mm-hmm.
people's scroll, and it's our communal story. And so you parade it around the synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
People will often touch it with either their tallis or their prayer shawl or their prayer book and kiss it to show reverence. In some synagogues it's adorable. They have a collection of stuffed Torahs, and the little kids will grab a stuffed Torah and follow the processional around the sanctuary.
Aw.
That's fantastic.
It's seriously adorable. It's a part. It's a part of the ceremony and the tradition. The Torah service is, and I apologize if I'm going off topic here, but the Torah service and the liturgy is written to mimic the Sinai experience. Like there's meant to be awe and wonder as the Torah is taken out and prepared to be read before the people.
Mm-hmm.
And we have lost some of that reverence and community because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually like really on topic, just for clarity. To be perfectly queer, very on topic. But I think there are so many small ways and big ways that faith communities' practices have changed during the pandemic. And we don't talk about it a lot on this podcast because this podcast is like not a church, not a congregation or a faith, like a worshiping community. But we talk about some of like the pandemic comes up a fair amount. And I think there's a unique place to that I don't think we've done enough of, certainly in the Christian communities I am aware of naming the things that have changed that are sad.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And because we're not naming it, then it comes out sideways, right? Then we have pushes to do things to get back to normal when nothing's going to be normal again. There is no normal. But to be able to say, that this particular aspect of worship that for some people was just like a thing that happened in worship, and for some people like who know the meaning and the connection to receiving the commandments and all of that, right, ties together, and to be able to say, yeah, that's missing, then creates the space to say, okay, are there other ways to do it? Or is this something that when the pandemic is actually over, we definitely need to go back to having this? Like, how do we make sure that people know that that Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and that the people are in awe, and that the people celebrate, and how do we continue to embody that in our worship practices? So,
It can be a very kind of cool experience. It becomes somewhat routine in that you do it every week, but it also kind of is a kind of an interesting sort of stop in the service. We take you at our synagogue, oftentimes the leader of services switches between, the preliminary and morning service, and then somebody else takes over to do the leading for the Torah service. And it's like, it's the music changes, and it's a there's this Sinai experience and the procession with the Torah scroll and the opening of it and the chanting, and it's kind of a beautiful experience.
Yeah.
I know in the hospital, communion has become an issue during the pandemic.
Yeah.
In large part because we don't have what is the term? Ecumenical minister? No, not ecumenical.
Eucharistic
That's the
ministers.
one.
Yeah.
Eucharistic ministers aren't coming into the hospital anymore. Primarily, it's our Catholic priests, and even they're trying to limit,
Mm-hmm.
handing people things to put in their mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and to some extent, there's also a lot of us don't realize how truly weird things have gotten until we're suddenly reminded. I was telling a story a couple weeks ago about how I was doing a class with some middle school students, and we, in passing, my co-pastor and I told a story about a time maybe 6 or 7 years ago when a guy predicted the end of the world, and the rest of the world thought he was, losing his marbles, and this was a memorable experience. And then we had to explain to these modern day middle school students that the reason why that was memorable was because it was unusual at the time, and that
Mm-hmm.
we weren't back then living in a time where there were, new terrifying news stories every day, and we weren't in a pandemic, and we weren't constantly bombarded with all this extra stuff. And because we eventually realized that they weren't getting it because they grew up in a very different time. And so we didn't even realize what their normal was.
Man,
Yeah.
that's really something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think when Emily talks about making sure that the tradition is passed on, we might need to start that work a little sooner than we thought.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that part of it, but
Yeah.
it makes sense.
Some bar mitzvah ceremonies, bar and bat mitzvah, the Torah is taken out and processed around the congregation, and then there's a ceremony where the rabbi hands it to the bar bat mitzvah's grandparents, who hand
Mm.
it to their parents, who hand it to the bar bat mitzvah,
Mm.
and so
Oh,
the scroll is kind of being passed from generation to generation to generation.
Yeah. That's
sure.
beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. We'll get into this more for our fifth Sunday, our episode on the fifth Sunday in Lent, when we talk about abundance and extravagance and kind of dive deeper into worship.
Oh, yes.
But there is this worship is special, and it's okay for it to be special and to have these particular moments of clarity and of meaning that are so much deeper than a lot of people realize, but also than just going about our daily lives. And I think part of that is that it helps our daily lives have richer meaning, right? Like you talked about communion and how that has changed in the hospital. Communion has changed in worship too, because when it was online, some congregations decided not to have communion. I am of the deep belief that no, we're going to keep having communion. We're just going to have it from our homes. And the gift that has been to make explicit that communion and that connection we have to each other is a connection that happens maybe with bread and cup, but also maybe with muffins or pancakes or crackers or juice or coffee, that the parts of communion that are so deeply meaningful and connective can happen in other parts of our lives. And so making those connections with worship and letting worship, and not just letting, but making worship continue to be worship makes a big difference. But it gets harder when different pieces of it have to shift and have to be different or have to be taken away. But that piece of from grandparent to parent to
Sure.
the newly about to be adult member is a beautiful.
It's interesting because you were talking about that with communion and it being this communal thing. I have attended services where I have seen communion be given. I have never personally taken it for what I
Sure.
suppose are obvious reasons, but thinking about Shavuot and the Tikkun Leil Shavuot that we were talking about before, to persuade that many Jews to stay up that late requires refreshment of some sort or another. And so there's usually, coffee is usually available pretty constantly, and there's a break in the evening for, blintzes and cheesecake and other appropriate festival food.
Mm-hmm.
Our services in our Saturday morning Shabbat services traditionally end with, kiddush and motzi, and are then followed by Shabbat lunch, which we are in the process of figuring out how to do again, even in this stage of the pandemic.
Yeah.
But that, I don't think we formalize it in the same way that my Christian friends do, but that sense of gathering and eating and sharing and talking and having this community experience is an important part of worship.
Mm-hmm.
It's an important
Yeah.
part of the experience. Going to the temple, like Shavuot was one of the Shalosh Regalim, the three pilgrimage festivals. People
Oh.
people schlepped to Jerusalem to have this experience, and
Mm-hmm.
the temple was certainly a site of worship, but it was also the time when everyone can get together and see their friends that you only saw at the three pilgrimage festivals when you brought
Sure.
when you brought your stuff and you made your sacrifices to God. So, there is this holy, sanctified nature of prayer and worship. And there's this togetherness, this is how we build community side to worship. It's like the old joke, Goldberg goes to synagogue to talk to God. I go to synagogue to talk to Goldberg.
Yep.
That's fantastic. I think there could be a pretty easy, Christian equivalent of that.
I think we would be less willing to make that joke because the self-righteousness would get in the way. But yes,
I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. No, 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 no.
right, like I'm not about to say it in case in a congregation, and so probably really not about to say it, but yeah, as I've been doing pulpit supply, it's fascinating to me to see the different practices in different congregations and what different people think is fine. And I'm doing it right now with all of my experience of a pandemic in Iowa, where the government intentionally is not protecting people, in a state where people had more protections and more intentionality by the government. And so then it's like, I don't know if it's safe. It doesn't feel safe because nothing feels safe in Iowa. And I'm not in Iowa.
that definitely has a everything is legal in New Jersey energy to it. Yeah.
Except for pumping your own gas.
Right.
Well, yes, of course.
That is very much
You have to keep some things, absolutely.
the important things. I mean, I think it's actually there's actually legit reasons why pumping your own gas is a thing. But anyway, yeah, that's fascinating.
Yes, this podcast is not officially taking a stance against the state of New Jersey or her people. And please do not take anything that we say about New Jersey in a litigious manner. So.
Okay, coming in with the disclaimers as always.
Also, murder is still bad.
Murder is still bad.
No particular reason to say that, just I feel like that's something that responsible people should say now.
Yeah, didn't we just say that last week?
Last week I just said that I had not had to say that on this podcast for quite some time, and I was very proud of us, and here we go.
Yep.
So
so Russell, is there anything else that you wish non-Jewish or especially Christian people understood about Shavuot or Jewish holy days more broadly?
I think, Shavuot is a strange holy day just in terms of kind of how it fits into the American calendar. It's kind of the holiday we don't do that much with in Hebrew school because by the time it comes, most Hebrew schools have broken for the summer, but kids haven't quite gone to camp. So it kind of is one that is not super well known and practiced in our community. It's a great holiday just in terms of, learning Torah and, celebrating it and kind of having this experience. It doesn't have the pomp and circumstance of shaking the lulav and the etrog or the, family gathering of the Seder at Passover, but it's, still kind of an amazing holiday with the traditions of the tikkun and all the cheesecake that people would want to eat or not, as the case may
or
be.
more.
sure,
it's
save some for the rest of us. It's okay.
Yeah. I will gladly take the cheesecake.
I think our holidays kind of have, our pilgrimage festivals kind of have three different, there's sort of different vibes on each of them, but they're also kind of have some things about them that are very similar, and they can be kind of fun holidays to experience and to gather together for and to really embrace.
Sure.
Yeah.
I have to say that there were several ages where I definitely would have loved the challenge of this is a holiday where you're supposed to try to stay up all night. So.
Oh, it's very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and as you were describing it, I was not familiar with it, and it sounds amazing. Like, I really want to go to one, right? And there's,
I suspect given where you are, you probably could.
I think I could. And certainly will go respectfully and not, as we like to remind our Christian listeners, especially, not Christian all over everything, but yeah, to be able to like, especially like as you're talking about the different, like if everybody gets a different hour to teach things, like there's so much diversity in what you could teach, and just to like be able to sit and absorb, this is the Enneagram 5 in me coming out, to sit and absorb all of the knowledge with cheesecake.
And to be fair, 2:00 in the morning sounds like a great time to talk about the Hunger Games, because the creepiness is definitely going to get across.
Speaking of Shavuot, we'll dive into our readings for this episode. Our first reading is from Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 11. God institutes the harvest feast, Shavuot, or the festival of weeks, and Israel offers to God the first fruits of the harvest, which God has given them. So one of the themes for this passage is first fruits, which, at least the way that I have learned it in Christianity, first fruits is also like a best of the best, like the best fruits, the first fruits, the primacy ones, which I don't know. Sometimes first fruits are like scrawny, but I've decided that they are the best ones. And so this reminded me of the Great British Baking Show. So in all of the competitions, right, the best of the best, the final product is always tasted first by, depending on which season, Mary Berry or Prue and Paul Hollywood. And so they are the like equivalent of God in this, I guess.
Yeah, well, to be fair, from what I understand of Britain, Mary Berry being the goddess of baking is kind of a given, but
that's fair. But yeah, so it's like the best of the best. They get the best of the best, and then everybody else gets to eat like what is left after the competition-y part.
I'm told everyone, including the production assistants, walk around with forks.
Yes.
That's fantastic. It has been really cool. The 2 seasons that they did in the pandemic, it's been really cool actually so it used to be that like people who left the show earlier came back, and family and friends and all gathered, and they can't do that now. But everybody in the production team is in a bubble together. And so now, instead of, all the family and everybody else just like still working, all of the people who have worked so hard on the show get to experience and support the final 3 and celebrate with them and eat their signature bakes and all of that stuff. And I actually like really love that shift. Like, it sucks that you can't be with your family, but to be able to like share that with the people who have spent weeks and weeks, months supporting you and washing your dishes and making sure you look good. Sure. And
yeah,
really cool. And then as we dive into the verses, in verses 7 and 8, we read, "We cried to the Becoming One, the God of our ancestors. The Becoming One heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Becoming One brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power, and with signs and wonders." And I love the beginning of verse 8 is like one that somehow has been like taken to heart and like somehow I memorized it. I don't know how, but it reminded me of, in the Ember in the Ashes series, the scholars are living under oppression, and there is this like cry and lament, and there are different people who try to resist, and there's a resistance and all of that. But Laia really becomes like the Moses figure in this. And over the course of the 4 books, like she raises her voice and she challenges and she brings people out from oppression. And there are definitely terrifying displays of power and signs and wonders and all of that stuff. But I really like the idea of Laia as a Moses figure in that. It's fun. I just love the Ember in the Ashes series, and it's been a while since I've referenced them.
Yeah. And I read verse 11, which says, "Then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord your God has given to you and to your house." So this celebration has an invite list. You celebrate with the priests and their families and any local immigrants or travelers. And so I just want to say, that not throwing out the clergy before you start the party is always nice and appreciated. Absolutely. But I'm also wondering about clergy who are also travelers now. And so the thought occurred to me, like Shepherd Book from Firefly, how how that show would have been so different if Shepherd Book had been a rabbi instead of a Christian pastor.
Oh.
There is a subgenre in fan fiction, obviously mostly powered by Jewish people in fandom, uh, where you take characters and imagine if they were Jewish and how would the story change. And one of my favorites for that was a fanfic that imagined if all of the original Avengers were Jewish and how that would change the tenor of the story. But
That's a deeply scary thought.
also it it was really interesting, and my favorite thing was that the very last Avenger to sort of both realize and also admit that they were Jewish was Steve Rogers, because of course his mother's name is Sarah,
Mm.
and in this version of the story she had married a Catholic man and had
Mm.
not been terribly observant personally, but he discovers through like the work of a historian or something that she actually had a Jewish background
Hmm.
and starts to embrace it. And it was really interesting. But like the different ways that the ethics in the show or in the movie or in the books or something and would have been changed and usually frankly examined more closely than the author was willing to do for using a culture that they were born and bred in.
Mm-hmm.
It can be very interesting.
Yeah. Particularly interesting in light of Russell's Jewish philosophy in the Hunger Games.
Yes.
Okay, now I'm Googling Jewish Avengers fan fiction.
Oh, there's lots. To be honest, I was first introduced to that whole subgenre because the actresses who play Jane Foster and Darcy Lewis, Natalie Portman and Kat Dennings, are both Jewish. And so it started with imagining, you know, if the movies acknowledged the fact that both of these women are Jewish, how would they be different? And then it started growing from there.
It's interesting. There's
So,
controversy now. They're making a movie about Golda Meir, the Israeli prime minister
sure.
from the 70s,
Oh.
and I think Helen Mirren is supposedly playing her. And there's some controversy about whether or not that should be a Jewish actress
Right.
playing Golda
Mm.
Meir. Interesting.
Yeah, I have definitely seen a lot of very interesting fandom meta on the character Worf from Star Trek. What is Klingon, but he was raised by human parents due to, you know, excessive backstory. And his human adoptive parents were explicitly Russian and heavily, heavily implied to be Jewish.
Mm.
They actually got one of the actors who was most famous for playing Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof to be his dad,
Oh, wow.
and his mom was a famous Jewish actress. And I think they only actually say outright that he was raised in a Jewish family like once, very briefly, but it's uh, led to things such as you know, the way Worf talks about Klingon ancestors and history and the various rituals and so forth has led more than one person to imagine what would have happened if he had had the opportunity to expound on the importance of tradition. And
Tradition.
yes, exactly, yes. So, as his father would say, of course.
Yes. I would just like to point out for everyone listening in at home that both Russell and I broke into dance at the tradition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, if I don't make Emily dance at least once an episode, it doesn't feel like a real episode. So I'm glad I managed to do that.
It's true. I do think though that there is, and I just want to there's so much good right now that I just want to talk about everything. But the controversy around, right, like if the character is Jewish and that is a prominent thing, like should the actor playing them be Jewish, it's not just like that is an aspect of this larger conversation around representation, because like for sure in the trans community, if you are not trans, you should not be playing a trans character. Certainly,
and disabled actors, and
right. And certainly, like if you are a cisgender man, you should not be playing a transgender woman. And it actually like causes harm in the long term, right? Like it causes harm. It is part of why trans women are killed so much. And I think whenever it's a group that is a group that is marginalized or oppressed or not properly represented, it makes sense to me. Like, I think I would fall on the, like, just not knowing much, but I would fall on the, yeah, she should be played by a Jewish actor, especially like when it is part of the story, right? Like,
one of the things that's starting to come out now in kind of the zeitgeist, um, I'm thinking of the Whoopi Goldberg controversy with what she said in, I
Right.
think, on The View, where
mm,
she got herself suspended. But this sense that Judaism is in this weird joint realm of being both a religion and a people or a nationhood. So
mm-hmm,
there's an ethnicity to it as well. And so that in many ways sort of puts a little bit of a different spin on lots of things. I spent a
mm-hmm,
fair amount of time in college, taking Jewish American history and studying Jewish culture and history, and this sense of being both a religious tradition and a racial identity causes some wrinkles in the way that
Yeah.
we look at the world. I
mm-hmm,
should say maybe I look at the world, but certainly the
yeah,
way I've been taught to look at the world.
Yeah.
yeah. And I think Rabbi Danya Rutenberg had a great Twitter thread, I think it was her, about Whoopi Goldberg's comments and the complicated nature of it, because I think Whoopi is Jewish, or at least has Jewish ancestry. And
Mm.
so it's like extra complicated. I don't know much about what she said, like what she actually said. I have just seen my Twitter feed of Twitter rabbis talking about
Yes.
it.
Well, and then there's the additional complication of how the reaction to it was affected by racism,
Mm-hmm.
and how if a white man had said the exact same thing, the reaction would have been quite different.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
That is
But I
both
do think
true
it,
and sad.
yeah.
yeah,
But I do think that it, like, circling back to the, like, acting and who represents who, part of it is, like, tied into what we were talking about in the deep dive with, like, Christian satyrs and the importance of not doing them.
yeah,
They're not the, like, most dangerous thing for Jewish people, but they contribute to a culture that says Christians can take what they want from Judaism. Christians can portray Jewish people, can appropriate culture.
it, there are so many groups that have the complicated aspects to them. I remember reading an interview with Alexis Bledel, who played the young girl Rory in Gilmore Girls. And I was surprised to learn that her native language, her first language, is not
Spanish.
English. She grew up speaking Spanish,
Hmm.
In
and
Argentina.
she's a Latina, but she, looks Caucasian. And the way that she has been treated in many situations has been affected by that. And so that's been an ongoing thing for her. And we don't acknowledge the fact that there are nuances to this stuff
Mm-hmm.
often enough.
Yeah.
Our second reading today is from Romans chapter 10, verses 8b through 13. Paul proclaims that all who believe and confess faith in Christ will be saved, whatever their background.
So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage is the, like, intention that Paul has is to specifically not condemn people for their background, right? It doesn't matter how you got to belief in Christ or faith in Christ or trust in Christ. It is that you are here that matters. And the way that gets twisted really easily. So it's not actually a theme in the thing, but frequently passages like this one get twisted to condemn, right? Instead of the emphasis being wherever you are coming from, the fact that you are here is what matters. It's you have to believe, say, do these things in order to be saved. And it's like, that's not what Paul was saying. Paul was making things more expansive, and then it's, like, used to be more exclusive. And it reminded me of The Little Mermaid, specifically the second Little Mermaid. And it's been a long time since I saw it, but so at the end of the original Little Mermaid, Ariel gets the gift of legs like she wants, and she gets to go live with Eric and marry and have kids and things. And yet the community that she becomes a part of develops this fear and distrust of mer people, like, not an intentional one, not an awareness of them, but, like, even she is, like, very hesitant because, and so, like, this space that was opened to be more expansive for her to be with the person that she loved, and to be in this new community then becomes an exclusive one. And so barriers get built up that keep her from being able to relate with her family of origin and the community that she comes from in ways that are harmful, and basically the entire plot of the second movie, I think, in my memory at least.
I generally have a policy of not watching Disney sequels unless they have specifically been recommended to me.
Yeah, I
So
don't
I have not seen that
recommend it. It just, I don't even remember why I watched it when I watched it. I think I was like babysitting or something.
Sure.
Probably, hopefully.
So in verse 10 we read, "For one believes with the heart, and so is justified, and one confesses with the mouth, and so is saved." But, of course, then there's the question of what if one can't talk? There is a genre of fan fiction that I've mentioned before where people are born with or eventually come to have and recognize that they have a soulmate or sometimes multiple soulmates. And sometimes they're different kind of soulmates, but that gets complicated. But some of these stories involve something called soul marks, which is the idea that you have the first words that your soulmate will say to you tattooed on you somewhere. And that, or you're often born with it like a birthmark, or if your soulmate is younger than you, then it shows up when they're born. And often they're also in your soulmate's handwriting, which is especially interesting because some people have terrible handwriting and it's kind of hard to read what those words are supposed to be. But there have been some interesting explorations of that, of what does that look like when your soulmate is, for example, deaf or mute, and maybe their first words to you will be in sign language, or maybe their first words to you will be written out instead of spoken out loud. And so there have been a few stories that explored the idea of how do you make a visual representation of sign language on a person's body instead of, writing by hand. And that's been very interesting. And sometimes there have been stories where that means that only one of the soulmates has a soul mark. And so when it comes to God and confessing things, I have to say that I think God would be up for some variations and not just having to confess with the mouth. But
that is, I think, very accurate. And that's I mean, I know I've been in Christian congregations where we've shifted from saying, God in your mercy, hear our prayer, to God in your mercy, receive our prayer, specifically as an acknowledgement that God does not need to hear in order to receive prayer.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Also, like, presumably God could get that kind of thing telepathically if God wanted to.
Right,
it's complicated.
Yeah.
God being God, some rules don't really exist.
True. And then in verse 12 we read, "For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same God is God of all and is generous to all who call on them." And my immediate reaction was, but there are distinctions. It is in fact true that hobbits and quote-unquote men and dwarves and elves all experience the world differently. There are distinctions, and yet they are all part of the fellowship. So yes, your past and your history and your ancestry and your particular lived experiences in the world are distinct, and what Paul is actually saying, right, is they don't keep you from being part of the community. They are part of you, and you are part of the community altogether. So let's go destroy the ring.
What struck me about that, especially coming from Paul, is, and I'm not my sense of the history of this isn't super clear, but at least today we say in a lot of our prayers, that God separated, created the people of Israel as a separate nation. The word holy in Hebrew is about separating and keeping and having separate people. So it's an interesting thing that he would say coming from whence he came.
Right, because Paul, even in writing this, is Jewish. And it's,
my understanding is that the church at the time was going through the conversation of, in order to be Christian, do you have to also be Jewish? And so Paul is trying to reinforce the idea that you can become Christian without going through or observing Jewish law, if that's not where you come from.
Mm-hmm.
That
And of
makes more
course, that
sense.
got more complicated later on.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that is also my understanding of it. But it is a tricky, like, again, it's part of this conversation that, like, there are different ways and framings that we use for the conversation throughout history. And in that time, it was who is allowed to be included. And now it's who can we exclude, which is the exact opposite. Or who can we say, but you have to be this in order to really count. Yeah. And then our gospel reading for this episode is Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. After his baptism, Jesus is led by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasts for 40 days and is tempted by the devil with much cherry picking of Bible verses. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of testing. The devil is like there to test Jesus, to test his loyalties, to test his commitment. And it's a mark of distrust, right? The test is inherently there is some trust that has to be proven, or that for some reason someone is not trustworthy. And so it reminded me of the Avengers in Winter Soldier, I think is that movie, but they're all like testing each other's, there's like testing of each other's loyalty, like, are you committed to this, is this what you're doing, and testing the loyalty to shield in particular. And the irony, of course, is that by that point, shield has been infiltrated by Hydra, so shield itself is not trustworthy, but is still like trying to test the loyalty of the Avengers to shield. And then it's figured out that like shield is not trustworthy, and so the Avengers' loyalty actually needs to be something that is not shield, but in fact some greater thing. And that actually feels like it fits really well, of like the devil being like, no, do you trust me? And it's like, no, well, no, you're not trustworthy. Trust has to be to something larger, so your testing is not legit.
Yeah.
Which felt like a long roundabout way of doing it. I do like all of the cherry picking of Bible verses, because we just have so much proof texting that we do today. And so then to like have proof texting happen both directions, where like Jesus is proof texting the devil, and then the devil is like, but I have proof texts too. Here, what about these two verses I'll throw out?
Well, I feel like when Jesus quotes Bible verses, he's doing so in a way to make it clear that their meaning is also the way that he means them is the way that they mean in context. When Satan is quoting Bible verses in this passage, it is not always with like the full contextual meaning being accurate. So
Details.
like there are ways to quote individual Bible verses without like intentionally destroying their meaning.
It is true.
We do that too in Talmud and Midrash in terms of how Bible verses get used as proof texts. It can get a little bit wacky.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with translations from the original language in the first place. But yeah.
That is true. And I think Luke also, but I know Matthew for sure. The like when Matthew quotes Hebrew scriptures, it's quoting the Greek version of the Hebrew.
Yeah.
And so then
Septuagint.
you actually get like not necessarily a super accurate translation. But any sort of translation is going to be interpretation, which we've talked about before.
Yeah.
But yeah. And then in the first verse, we read, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan, where he was baptized, and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness. And I love the idea of going into the wilderness. And so I always have like conflict when it comes to the wilderness, because it's so frequently portrayed as like this scary space, but also Jesus is frequently going like off on his own to pray. So I was thinking about like why Jesus was going to the Holy Spirit. And as long as you don't read the rest of the passage, where it says to be tested by the devil for 40 days, then it could be that Jesus is going for respite or penance or preparation. I don't know, any of the many reasons that Luke Skywalker had for leaving all of everyone else after Return of the Jedi in episode 6 to go be by himself on this far off island / planet of the Jedi, which was, I think, mostly he felt guilty about things, more so than that he was actually trying to get any sort of like nourishment. And I mean, he did. He got.
I think we can also leave open the idea that Jesus can multitask. Like just because he was getting tested by the devil doesn't mean he didn't also take some naps.
I would hope he took some naps, because fasting for 40 days, like, you gotta be taking lots of naps.
Yeah, but if you want to cherry pick Bible versus Emily, that is entirely up to you, I guess.
It was a theme.
Yes. And then in verse 7, we read, "If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." And he's saying that if Jesus will worship him, then the entire world will be Jesus's. And so I have to admit that when it comes to the original set of Star Trek movies, my favorite is definitely number 6, The Undiscovered Country. But number 5 is not one of the most popular ones because this was a case of someone making a movie instead of going to therapy about their issues with religion. And which, happens. I've seen more than a few of those movies.
I think
not
you've
always about
mentioned
religion.
this movie before.
Yes, I have. But I've also mentioned the concept of sometimes people write a book or make a movie or make a TV show instead of going to therapy. And really, you could do both at the very least. But also, and sometimes it turns into an interesting movie. So Star Trek movie number 5 is called The Final Frontier. And that movie is famous because James T. Kirk winds up having an ongoing argument with a very powerful being who claims to be God, and then gets in the ultimate one-liner because at one point, this character calling himself God makes a very similar offer to Kirk in exchange for the use of the Enterprise, Kirk's spaceship, to which Captain Kirk memorably replies, "What does God need with a spaceship?" And I love that bit because, if you're God, you really shouldn't need a spaceship. That seems like you should be able to do things without having to use physical stuff. That's fine. And also, if you're God, then you should be better at arguing than to allow James T. Kirk to outwit you, which, he's not bad, but it's not what he's best at for the most part. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like Jacob being good at
it's not
wrestling,
like Spock
and
was
so
the one
God
who was
so a mysterious person who frequently is ascribed to being God wrestles with Jacob all night. Not the same.
Yeah. And I have to say that when I thought of that, I also realized that in this passage, Satan seems a little needy. In this passage when he's trying to tempt Jesus.
Right. I need you to maybe the devil is 2 on the Enneagram and slightly disintegrating, and so needs to be needed, and then also has a martyrdom complex about if their needs aren't getting met.
So if you're asking yourself, is this how God would treat me? Then, ask yourself, God doesn't need to be needy.
Yeah.
And ask yourself if that's what's going on. So Russell, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
I feel like we've covered most of the things I was thinking about.
Okay.
Do you have any particular favorite places that people can go to look up answers to questions they might have about Jewish holy days? Or
so there are some great kind of websites on the different kind of movement pages. So the Union for Reform Judaism or the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, along with Chabad and I imagine the Orthodox Union, have some good sort of resources. I can send you guys those websites if you'd like.
That would be awesome.
Absolutely. Sure.
That would be awesome.
So we will post those in our episode description.
Yeah. Yep. Wonderful. Thank you for being with us, Russell. It is always good to have you on our podcast. And
thank you guys for having me.
Yeah. And thank you, dear listeners, for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the second Sunday in Lent. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsattchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. As the ancient Christians said, Pax Vobiscum.